The Portrait of Mr. W.H. by Oscar Wilde. Narrated by Brian Godwin. Chapter 1. I had been dining with Erskine in his pretty little house in Birdcage Walk, and we were sitting in the library over our coffee and cigarettes when the question of literary forgeries happened to turn up in conversation. I cannot at present remember how it was that we struck upon this somewhat curious topic, as it was at that time, but I know that we had a long discussion about Macpherson, Ireland, and Chatterton, and that with regard to the last I insisted that this so-called forgery was merely the result of an artistic desire for perfect representation, that we had no right to quarrel with an artist for the conditions under which he chooses to present his work, and that all art being to a certain degree a mode of acting, an attempt to realize one's own personality on some imaginative plane out of reach of the trammeling accidents and limitations of real life, to censure an artist for a forgery was to confuse an ethical with an aesthetical problem. Erskine was a good deal older than I was, and had been listening to me with amused deference of a man of 40, suddenly put his hand upon my shoulder and said to me, "What would you say about a young man who had a strange theory about a certain work of art, believed in his theory, and committed a forgery in order to prove it?" "Ah, that is quite a different matter," I answered. Erskine remained silent for a few moments, looking at the thin grey threads of smoke that were rising from his cigarette. "Yes," he said, after a pause, "quite different." There was something in the tone of his voice, a slight touch of bitterness, perhaps, that excited my curiosity. "Did you ever know anybody who did that?" I cried. "Yes," he answered, throwing his cigarette into the fire. "A great friend of mine, Cyril Graham. He was very fascinating, and very foolish, and very heartless. However, he left me the only legacy I ever received in my life." "What was that?" I exclaimed. Erskine rose from his seat and going over to a tall inlaid cabinet that stood between the two windows, unlocked it, and came back to where I was sitting, holding in his hand a small panel picture set in an old and somewhat tarnished Elizabethan frame. It was a full-length portrait of a young man in late 16th century costume, standing by a table with his right hand resting on an open book. He seemed about 17 years of age and was of quite extraordinary personal beauty, though evidently somewhat effeminate. Indeed, had it not been for the dress and the closely cropped hair, one would have said that the face with its dreamy, wistful eyes and its delicate scarlet lips was the face of a girl. In manner, and especially in the treatment of the hands, the picture was reminded of Francois Clouet's later work. The black velvet doublet with its fantastically gilded points and the peacock blue background against which it showed up so pleasantly, and from which it gained such luminous value of color, were quite in Clouet's style.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?